How's it going? Hope you had a good networking break. All right, let's get things kicked off.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Michael Epping, and I'm a product manager with the customer experience team for Entra at Microsoft, and I'm here with my colleague, Tim.
Hey, folks. I'm Tim. I'm a product manager in Microsoft's identity security team. And today we're going to talk about bringing Passkeys into your passwordless journey. Woo! Yeah. So just a quick agenda of what we'll cover today. We'll focus on some of the challenges in securing access and identities, some state of the MFA in the enterprise, some learnings that we've observed from organizations implementing passkeys and phishing-resistant authentication, some deployment guidance and recommendations, and maybe a little look at what's coming next. So first, you've probably heard a lot about this. You've seen a whole bunch of slides around this whole presentation about scary news articles. So I won't dive too much here, but the key point is that identity attacks are always on the rise. We just launched our Microsoft Digital Defense Report for 2024 a couple days ago. Link at the bottom left in the screen here. But what we're observing is that password-based attacks are, non-surprisingly on the rise. We've seen an increase from about 4,000 password-based attacks per second to about 7,000 attacks per second, so pretty significant increase. But attackers aren't stopping there, right? They're targeting traditional MFA, doing MFA prompt bombing, MFA phishing, right? Trying to get that code from users. So we've seen an increase there as well, about 6,000 attacks per day occurring. But beyond that, attackers are also shifting away from targeting credentials. They're targeting token theft as well. Somewhere in the tune of about 39,000 token thefts are occurring per day in our observance across Azure and the Entra ID platform. This call kind of points to the whole reason that all of us are in this room, to drive phishing-resistant authentication across our customers and the industry to tackle these problems. And at Microsoft, when attackers adapt, we adapt too. We have a rich history of bringing phishing-resistant authentication capabilities to all of our users, some of which have been around for quite some time, like certificate-based authentication or early introduction of security keys and FIDO 2 into the ecosystem, or even Windows Hello for Business, which has been around for quite some time. Most recently, we've introduced a few other passkey capabilities. Our Mac OS single sign-in platform credential that provides native passkey authentication on Mac OS, as well as seamless single sign-on, and bringing device-bound passkey support into Microsoft Authenticator, which we announced earlier this year. And with device-bound passkey support in Microsoft Authenticator, we've now given the ability for users to have that passkey authentication, that phishing-resistant authentication in their pocket, giving that ability to have a seamless same device authentication experience and a cross-device authentication experience to access all the resources and apps. So I want to kind of shift and take a look at some learnings from a large organization. And big surprise, that organization is Microsoft. So we're going to talk a little bit about how Microsoft's been living the phishing-resistant authentication journey, and starting with where we were a year ago, or a few years ago. So back in about 2022, all Microsoft employees were using MFA and strong authentication access resources, many using passwordless authentication via the Microsoft Authenticator app, even phishing-resistant with Windows Hello for Business. When we started our approach to drive towards phishing-resistant authentication, there was not a whole lot of factors available, and there's some burden with getting every user to have phishing-resistant authentication, specifically when it came to distribution of security keys, where scenarios we can't use a device platform credentials. We took the approach of focusing at the user level and ensuring that before we enforce phishing-resistant authentication, we had to support every scenario in which the user had to access a resource, a remote machine, or an application for their day-to-day business. Our approach here was targeting high-risk users first, trickling down to less complex scenarios and users to get to the point of getting towards 100% phishing-resistant authentication. But with these kind of complexities and the problems, what we ended up finding out is it was a slow adoption process and not a great user experience. That brings us to kind of where we're at today. We've kind of undergone this radical security transformation at Microsoft through a company-wide effort called the Secure Future Initiative. And with that refocus, we looked at our strategy and shifted from going from a user level to looking at a platform plus user combination. So we look at users on, let's say, Mac OS, and we look at the capabilities that are present there, what resources they had to access, what apps they had to access, And we validate that we have the right credentials to support those scenarios. And when we have that capability, we then enforce the user. And then we move on. Move to Android, we move to iOS, right? And where the user moves across platforms, we validate and enforce. We take the same approach and do this in waves to ensure that we're getting towards a complete 100% phishing-resistant authentication across the company. With the Passkeys now in Microsoft Authenticator, we've also reduced the complexity of taking this approach. So it's no longer about the complexity of getting security keys to every single user and the cost associated with managing that in distribution. But now it's easily accessible in every user's pocket to use across their devices and on their same device as well. And that's helped us accelerate our journey. And we pair that all with learnings around providing more robust documentation to our users internally at Microsoft and providing better training for users and our support systems as well, and bringing more humans into that process to deliver on getting towards that end goal of phishing resistant everywhere. One of the other key things that we've done in this space to help our journey is focus on the onboarding and recovery problems that are prevalent within the phishing resistant kind of deployment capabilities that we have today, and providing all of our employees a way to quickly get back into their account or set up new devices if they were to lose access. So where are we going? By 2025, every single employee in the company will have a roamable passkey in their pocket they can use across their devices. And wherever possible, we're also registering passkey on their platforms as well. So we have a seamless end user experience. So regardless if it's a developer, a marketer, or someone in our C-suite, everyone is going to be doing phishing-resistant authentication all the time. So let's take a little bit of shift and go beyond just Microsoft and focus on some learnings that we've had from some of our other customers that have deployed or are deploying phishing-resistant authentication. The first thing I want to talk about is registration and touch on the fact that device support is kind of paramount to success here. As we've worked with customers that are deploying phishing-resistant auth and passkeys, specifically with device-bound passkeys, we've observed that not everyone is going to have the right OS, the right devices to support device-bound passkey requirements, specifically on like mobile devices, since it requires a little bit more modern OS on Android and iOS. And so that kind of points to that security keys are still a necessity. You can't just get away with leveraging mobile-based passkeys. Not only for the scenarios where those mobile devices don't support device-bound passkeys, but even for high-assurance scenarios. And with all of that, adding these restrictions to the enterprise causes a lot of headaches for users. And specifically, needing to be able to know when those headaches are in place and make sure that your user experience is accounting for that, and then also supporting that with documentation and training to your users. And lastly, with the WebAuthn registration experience, it's new to a lot of folks, and it can be pretty confusing. As an example, when we started out bringing device-bound passkey support into Microsoft Authenticator, we went through this design approach and had to introduce all these steps to educate the user on how to get the app, how to have device-specific instructions to go turn on Authenticator as a passkey provider on their device. Remind them to save it into Microsoft Authenticator when they're given a choice. And then also remind them how to use the WebAuthn QR code, connect their device, scan the QR code, connect their device, right? And that's a lot of context switching that ultimately leads to a lot of success, or a lot of failure where we were hoping to get success. So what we ended up doing is taking kind of a pivot and trying to simplify this approach. Really just trying to get the user to sign into Microsoft Authenticator, where we can check that the settings are in the right place, they're configured correctly, and then ultimately, all we can do from there is just create the passkey on their behalf and save it in the Authenticator. So a very simple process, removing all those context switching and all those things they have to remember and just putting it right in the app, right at their fingertips. So going beyond that, I want to talk a little bit about learnings from authentication. Just like in registration, passkeys are still new to a lot of users, as sign-in experience is fairly new. And we have to make it an experience where they don't have to think about how they're signing in. Keep it simple, just get them back into their account. And the key point here also is that you need to make sure all your apps and your scenarios are supporting passkeys, whether that's natively the application supports authentication with a passkey, or you have a brokerized application that can provide that seamless single sign-on experience. But across all of this, we've also learned that Bluetooth can be a limiting factor. There's scenarios where developers are on a workstation that just doesn't have a Bluetooth capability, or they are on an environment where those wireless communications are not allowed. So you have to then shift and think about use of security keys for different personas in those different high assurance scenarios. And the last thing I want to leave you with is a little bit about onboarding and recovery. Onboarding is a big problem as well when it comes to phishing-resistant authentication enablement in an organization, often relying on phishable methods, right, distributed by an admin or the organization. So a lot of organizations are looking for a better solution here to get a high assurance onboarding process right into phishing-resistant authentication. And then synced Passkeys specifically, a lot of organizations are proceeding cautiously here. They see the need and the benefit for scenarios like frontline workers or students in the education space. But for the general workforce, it can have a little concern from a trust perspective and a management perspective. And then recovery is also another scenario where a lot of organizations are having some concern. Specifically, as we know, as we better protect the authentication pipeline and provide phishing-resistant auth, attackers are going to be focusing on that recovery aspect. So not only do we need to have a high assurance onboarding, but we need to have the high assurance recovery process where we can remove humans from the loop. And I don't want to just end with all these learnings that we've had here. Michael's done a really great job of taking these customer learnings and building actionable deployment guides for customers. So I want to pass it to him to take us through that.
All right, thanks, Tim. So one of the things that we really want for our customers is to not fall into some of the same patterns that we fell into that caused issues for our own internal deployment. So one of the things that we've done based on some of the learnings that we've had from our own internal deployment is we've published a new passwordless deployment guide that hopefully will help customers learn from us, avoid the same mistakes. So hopefully it's visible there in the upper right corner, but it's at aka.ms/passwordless guide. So this just came out about 2 weeks ago. When we think about these deployments in most customer environments, there's a couple main steps at a high level that we think that most customers need to do. So the first one seems very simple, and Tim kind of touched on this, but it's determine your user personas. Every organization is going to look a little bit different. You may have information workers, you may have frontline workers, you may have students, you may have users who have especially high assurance requirements like your administrators. You need to break these out and figure out what is our deployment plan for each one of these different personas because they have unique needs. And I'll talk a little bit more about what a deployment might look like for some of these in a second. Once you've determined your user personas, you also want to think about the devices. So are they on a sufficiently up-to-date operating system? What credential makes sense for them based on what we're seeing? Then you have to actually go drive your registration. Obviously, rolling out phishing-resistant passwordless is a very user-facing project. So there's a lot of organizational change management that you need to take into account as you engage in this type of project. So yes, you need to enable the policies and start to push users to register, but you also need to communicate to the organization. So this might mean emails, it might mean doing some sort of webinars, finding champions in the organization to help you push users to get that registration going. And then you need to continue to drive the registration and drive the usage of those credentials and really critically measure how well you're doing. So you don't want to get to the enforcement phase where you start to turn on enforcement and quickly realize, oh, I have a major problem. I'm locking out my users because I didn't do a good job of getting them registered and getting them using those credentials. So it's super critical to actually measure how you're doing through the earlier phases of registration and usage so that when you get to the enforcement point where you're actually going to mandate the use of these credentials, the user is ready to go and things will go fairly smoothly. And then of course, as we get to phishing resistance, the risk to our organization does not go away. Our attackers are going to move on to other ways to compromise the organization, which might mean token theft. It might mean trying to register their own device on a user's account. There are still things that we want to look at and think about in terms of managing risk for our phishing-resistant passwordless users. So diving into this slightly deeper, in our guidance, there's kind of 4 user personas that we think most customers probably want to start with. So information workers are probably the easiest, and then it gets a little bit more complicated as you go through. So depending on your frontline worker scenarios, you may have specific limitations. Like we talked to a lot of manufacturers where users are not allowed to have phones on the factory floor, so maybe FIDO to security keys make sense in that context. Vice versa, you may have scenarios where the user is not able to use a FIDO2 security key, so Authenticator app on a mobile phone might make sense, or Windows Hello for Business on their Windows PC might make sense. We need to think about what makes sense for each user persona. One thing I really want to call out here, which is a common pitfall we see customers fall into, is trying to start a pilot with their IT pros. IT pros and your average knowledge worker are two different user personas. And one of the things that we see customers struggle with is trying to solve all problems for all personas at once. It's really, really important to reduce your attack surface where you can, make progress where you can. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So when we work with customers, we really push them to get rolling on the users where they are able to make progress immediately or quickly. So that might mean information workers for many customers. It might mean frontline workers. IT pros and these other high assurance scenarios can have some complex requirements around RDP and SSH and PAM and all sorts of things like that. So we don't want to get hung up on those workers if we can make progress with our other user populations and reduce the risk to the organization. As we think about devices, so again, for a lot of these users, we do need to evaluate like what type of device are they using. So we may look at our users and say, our strategy for Windows is Windows Hello for Business. And our users are on Windows 10, they're on Windows 11, we're pretty much good to go. However, if I look at my Android users, maybe I have a significant population on Android 12 or 13, like an older Android version, and so they're not quite ready yet. Maybe I need to think about, do I need to give them security keys? Can we get their phones upgraded? There's considerations like that that you need to take into account so that you can have a successful rollout. If you just start pushing users to register and they're on an older OS or an OS that's lacking a capability that you need, you're obviously going to run into issues. Once you're ready for deployment, this is the general strategy that we think that most organizations should employ. Again, you need to think about your user personas. You're going to tailor this for the particular users that you're working with. So if we take the example of information workers, which is for many organizations is the easiest place to start, their process is going to look something like this in most cases if you want to be successful using the strategy we outline. So you have to have some sort of onboarding process. For your existing users, they may already be registered for MFA, and they have credentials and the ability to do strong authentication already, and so we can move on. For our new users, we may need to do some sort of onboarding process to gain some level of trust that this person is who they say they are, and then we can issue them something like a Microsoft temporary access pass that they can use to move on to step 2, which is bootstrapping a portable credential. So when we say portable credential, what we're really talking about is a credential that can be used across devices so that we can bootstrap additional credentials in other places. So again, this may mean Passkeys in Microsoft Authenticator app, and for many customers, that's going to make a lot of sense. This may also mean FIDO 2 security keys. For your high assurance scenarios, this may mean smart cards or something along those lines. But the value here is that we're getting this portable credential that the user can use to authenticate to services on their mobile device and use for cross-device flows, like moving on to their work PC or their work Mac, where they can then set up their locally available credential on that device as well, which might mean Windows Hello for Business on Windows. It might mean Platform SSO Secure Enclave key on Mac OS. If they use a tablet, it might mean an additional passkey in Microsoft Authenticator app. The reason we want to do this is because we should keep in mind that the goal with deploying passwordless phishing resistance is not just security, it's the improved end user experience and the improved speed of authentication. By getting a credential available for the user everywhere that we can, where they do regular work, we can make sure that they have a nice, smooth end user experience across all their devices. And then as you start to drive the usage of those phishing-resistant credentials, make sure that you're continuing to measure. So I may sound like a broken record, and I'm going to keep harping on this. If you see me talk about any of our deployment guidance in the future, measure, 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 measure. You need to track, are our devices ready? Are my users actually registered on Windows, on iOS? And then you need to make those determinations before you can move on to doing the actual enforcement. In our ecosystem, so for customers that we work with, the enforcement phase is using conditional access, where you can enforce things like Windows Hello for Business or Passkeys or smart cards and cert-based authentication. Again, we need to think about our rollout from a user device pair perspective. We're not going to just target one user and say, this user does phishing-resistant authentication across the board now. We may start with them on Windows and then iOS, because we saw from our telemetry and our data gathering, they're good to go on those OSs. Then we can move on to Android and Mac OS and Linux and Chrome OS and all the other platforms that they may use for work. So we want to make sure that we roll out gradually, not just by user, but by user device pair wherever possible, so that we're not just breaking the user, impacting the business, and potentially creating havoc with our rollout. So a couple key takeaways and go-dos. One thing that we really, really want customers to do is let your security-minded users help you out on this journey. If you have users who are motivated to go buy their own FIDO key and then want to use it for work purposes, let them do it. So let security people kind of help you in your environment become advocates for this program for you. Don't block them from being more secure if they want to be. Recognize it's a journey. Hopefully all the slides I just covered show that this is a process, and it involves a lot of effort across different user personas, a lot of measurement, and tracking your progress. So don't get discouraged if it's not a flip the switch type deployment. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Reduce your attack surface where you can. Deploy for personas where it makes sense. Again, move on to the trickier scenarios after you have reduced the attack surface where it's already viable to do so in your environment. Use passkeys wherever possible. Again, smart cards are an option, and a lot of our guidance does go into what you need to think about for like smart cards and CERT-based authentication, but wherever possible, we really want customers to focus on passkeys and FIDO. And don't forget about all those other OSs that users have out in your ecosystem. A lot of executives at many organizations I work with are using Mac OS, developers on Linux, in educational institutions, there's a lot of Chrome OS, so don't forget about these other OSs that are out there as well. We want to get broad coverage across all of these. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Tim to talk a little bit about what's coming in the future.
Yeah, so we've got some stuff that we are working on right now to make deployment and enforcement easier for every organization. One of these things that we just public previewed back in August is support for FIDO2 provisioning of security keys. We've extended our Microsoft Graph support there for integrators and customers to be able to build their own provisioning process to make day one onboarding with phishing-resistant easier. We've also been working on improving how organizations manage passkeys in their environment, in their configurations by introducing passkey profiles, an ability where you can target sets of users and groups, assign synced passkeys, device passkeys, or specific AA GUIDs for certain subsets of users to really help with those different personas and needs across the organization. We're also working on registration campaigns that'll allow organizations to deploy passkeys, get users registered before you move to enforcement. And of course, the big one, adding synced passkey support across Entra ID as well. We're actively working on bringing that natively into the enterprise for Entra ID customers. And also working on utilizing passkey storage natively on the Windows Hello container. So for scenarios where you don't have a managed device and you can't deploy Windows Hello for Business, you'll have the ability to store an Entra ID passkey natively on that platform to allow authentication across apps and services as well. And I think with that, we are almost out of time, and I just want to say thank you for letting us talk with you this morning about how to deploy passkeys in enterprise.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Mike. There's a couple questions in the chat, but are there any questions in the audience? Right on. Oh, yeah, sorry. Go straight to the microphone.
Do you have a window of when the passkey binding to Authenticator will come out of preview?
Attestation support?
I'm sorry?
GA.
Oh, GA support?
Yes.
Yes, hopefully in like a month or so.
Okay.
As we're in.
Great. Thanks.
How you doing? Barty Marabian, Easy Dynamics. You may have touched on it with the onboarding registration API, but just wanted to ask it more directly. Is there going to be some sort of integrating with third-party partners that have some sort of autopilot capability for pre-onboarding of these requirements for device-bound keys when giving that to our user base?
Yeah, absolutely. We've actually partnered with around 10 ISV and credential management service providers to help bootstrap and make that process of pre-registration or acquiring security keys and distribution easier. We have a blog post that goes into our partnerships right now, and we're opening anyone that can leverage those APIs to help address that need to help bootstrap and get phishing-resistant authentication day one.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks,
Awesome.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Cool.